Hello. So we're going to try to learn a little bit more about Adam Smith and his vision for free markets. So Adam Smith writes in the early Industrial Revolution, this period in Western Europe and, of course, starting in America as well, a really sort of huge technological progress and changing of the very fabric of society. And this is where sort of we begin, the vast majority of us, to be able to escape a life of subsistence. And this technological progress, of course, also helped the world be more connected, in good ways and in bad ways. But that hockey stick of productivity also coincided with a hockey stick of the speed of news. So if you ever feel overwhelmed by the amount of news gushing at you, you're not alone. And this economic growth is great for so very many reasons. Childhood mortality drops, lifespan increases, quality of life increases probably as we've got standard of living increasing, but there are costs to be borne as well. And one of the sort of critical costs, especially in our century, is our environmental costs. You just can't produce more and use more resources without there being environmental issues. The title of Smith's book is The Wealth of Nations, and that's really what he was about, right? What is wealth? How is it created? How do we grow it? And because he spent some time in France tutoring, he picked up from the physiocrats in France, and Quesnay specifically, this new thinking that wealth was more than stockpiles of gold, which, according to sort of mainstream mercantilists, thought was really how you would define your national strength and therefore the success of your economy. So instead of a stock of gold, these French physiocrats were starting to think about the sort of wealth being created by agricultural workers and the land that they're working. Couldn't we also consider that a country that's growing in agricultural productivity is growing in wealth? And so the physiocrats introduced this idea, and Smith took it even further and said, well, why not all labor? What about the factory workers, the textile workers? Aren't they also producing something of value that is going to satisfy somebody's needs and also to provide them with income, and therefore the ability to satisfy their own future needs? So wealth is more than gold. The wealth of nations needs to be redefined, and Adam Smith does just that. So there's this age-old economic problem that has been discussed already, and that problem, to remind you, is limited resources and unlimited human material wants. So what is the best way to solve that problem? In other words, what's the best way to meet the most needs and wants that we can, right? That's becomes the desire and the goal of a successful economy, is to meet more needs than less needs. And Adam Smith's solution was by trusting markets and leaving them alone. I have an asterisk there because he doesn't intend to keep them exactly alone. There's some things that markets fail to do, and we'll say more about that. But for now, resources basically are in the best hands if we allow buyers and sellers to make free choices about what to buy and what to produce. And as you are pretty well aware already, having lived this long, what gets produced depends on what people want. So you can think about people as people casting dollar votes for goods and services, and the things that get produced inevitably are the things that are that more people want, right? Because people are willing to pay for the things they want, and so you get this sort of nice feedback of people signaling what they want, and the producers naturally being attracted to those types of production and using those resources in that particular way that meets those needs. And this all works because people are self-interested and know their own preferences and therefore know how to use their dollars. And producers are also self-interested and know that they don't want to produce something that's worthless because that is silly, and it also gives them no income of their own. So the system sort of self-regulates, and resources are used in a pretty efficient way. Efficient here meaning just that they're not wasted on things that people don't want. However, the last bullet point here, this does mean that people with more dollars get more say in what's produced, and this is one of the failures, especially in later stage capitalism, perhaps like the US is currently experiencing, about rising inequality. There could be a breakdown of this idea that free markets always provide society with the products and the goods that they most want. So a big, or perhaps the biggest finding of Adam Smith is the invisible hand. That you no longer need something visible commanding the resources in the economy to their best uses, or to uses that the crown or those in charge would have them used for, but rather that everyone is better served when you allow markets to do their thing. Buyers and sellers get to decide what to produce, what to buy, and the efficiency that's gained from cutting out the middleman and from allowing buyers and sellers to communicate directly leads to economic growth. Fewer resources are wasted, and the competition between firms is what sort of pushes them to continue to find better products, to beat out their competitors, and it also pushes them to reduce costs, to beat out competitors in cost savings. So notice the importance of competition. In fact, self-interest alone is not the invisible hand. You've got to have check and balance of competition. So self-interest and competition together are what makes up the invisible hand. And a quick little mind experiment will help us to realize why, without competition, self-interest is sunk as a way to make society better off and create economic growth. If everything we bought was produced by monopolies, economic theory predicts and practice proves this, prices are higher, generally quality is lower, and waste is not something that firms really worry about because they don't have to cut costs, they don't have to face the rigors of competition. So in Adam Smith's view, government does exist, and it exists in various forms, but it must at least maintain competition, right? So a role of the government will be to sort of act as the force, the mediating force on business self-interest, and indeed on anyone who gets so large that they can sort of exploit that position and, so to speak, get fat off that position. So the idea that some sort of modern, what we'd call free market fundamentalists would have us believe, which is that we should always be pursuing smaller government and more lax regulations and pressure on businesses, is simply not what Adam Smith would have us do. It's not what historical, true free market capitalism is about. In fact, Smith, in his own words, believe it or not, we've got a recording, said of businesses that industrialists are generally have an interest to deceive and even oppress the public. People in the same trade seldom meet together, but the conversation ends in a conspiracy against the public or in some diversion to raise prices. So the key ingredients of free market system, besides this philosophy of the invisible hand, are private property and good laws and protections of that private property, and free markets. And one of the reasons that free markets are also sometimes called capitalism, and that's invented by Karl Marx, that term, is that capital goods are so important in early capitalism and even modern capitalism. So capital goods, as a reminder, are machines and other human-made aids to production that are part of the four types of resources that we know to be classified in economics: land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurship. So markets are formal or informal. There's so many different types of markets. Markets that take place online, for instance, markets that take place over the phone, markets that take place in physical spaces. But generally they share the characteristics of being voluntary. Usually there's competition, and they're sort of reciprocal. And we know the story of the Industrial Revolution. It's this perfect storm of changing social norms, hungry peasants roaming the English countryside, needing jobs, needing a way to feed their families, and at the same time these sort of inventions, some of which are about power, getting sort of power to equipment, and getting better ways to remove seeds from cotton specifically. So the textile industry really starts the Industrial Revolution. So there's this technology piece, but there's also the specialization piece. This is what Adam Smith sort of famously described in his pin factory, that it's through specialization of labor that we can increase the productivity of that limited or scarce resource of labor and get more out of our resources, right? And the more specialization that would occur, and also the more technology that would occur, we'd experience this economic growth as a result. So the massive increase in worker productivity in the Industrial Revolution, continuing to today, is exactly an example of this sort of twofold revolution in technology and specialization. Smith is not so naive as to imagine there are no problems. In fact, many have spoken of the problems of capitalism. The utopian socialists, and then Karl Marx, but even earlier than that, Adam Smith is talking about some of the problems with capitalism. But in the law of accumulation and the law of population, he finds a problem and then solves it. So the law of accumulation is one of the reasons that you see economic growth in Adam Smith. And it's this idea that specialization of labor, which we know he's a fan of, and that the Industrial Revolution has really begun to spawn more and more of, creates increased production and more growth, right? Because we're getting more out of our resources. And those profits need somewhere to go, and under competition, firms are motivated to reinvest their profits for their own growth, to buy more machines, to compete against their rivals. So you get this sort of profits are reinvested for their growth, and part of those profits will go towards more machines and more specialization of labor. But notice they also need more laborers. The demand for labor will increase. And when the demand for labor increases, other things equal, the price of labor will go up. Wage rate will go up because this firm and other firms are expanding and needing more labor. So wages will rise according to the law of accumulation, eating into the profits of the firm and thus sort of stopping the growth from happening. But there is a counterbalancing law of population. As wages rise, families can afford more food, fewer of their children will die, population will rise, and as population rises, wages will fall again as the supply of laborers has now fallen back down. So the seesaw effect of profits rising and then falling and then rising and then falling again is sort of this engine of economic growth for Adam Smith. And one more thing before we go. It's probably clear to you, but perhaps you haven't thought about it for a while, that capitalism can coexist with many different political systems. So you can have state capitalism, as we would classify China. You can have democratic capitalism, as you would classify India, the US, the UK, in fact, much of the world. But it's worth noting that capitalism is an economic system, not a political system. And so even amongst capitalist systems, you see quite a variety in the size of the government.